The New York Society pages couldn't stop talking about Victoria Reynolds. At 45, she was still breathtakingly beautiful, impossibly rich, and about to marry James Morrison, the most eligible bachelor in Manhattan's elite circle. But Victoria had a secret that could destroy everything she'd built. 25 years ago, she'd given up a baby for adoption. Now that child had found her. Victoria stared at herself in the mirror of her penthouse apartment. Her perfectly styled, blonde hair and designer dress couldn't hide the worry in her blue eyes. The wedding was in 3 days, and James still didn't know about her past. None of them did. Not her socialite friends, not her business partners, and certainly not her future stepchildren. The phone rang, making her jump. It was Emily, the daughter she'd never known, calling again. Victoria's hands shook as she ignored the call. She'd been doing that for weeks now, ever since the first letter arrived. Mrs. Reynolds? Maria, her housekeeper, knocked on the bedroom door. "Mr. Morrison is here." Victoria quickly wiped away a tear and fixed her makeup. James couldn't see her like this. Their relationship was built on the image of perfection, the successful businessman and the sophisticated widow. It had taken Victoria 20 years to climb to the top of New York society after starting as a simple receptionist. She wouldn't let anything ruin it now. "Victoria, darling." James walked in, tall and handsome at 52, his silver hair making him look distinguished rather than old. He kissed her cheek and held out a small box from Tiffany's. A little pre-wedding gift. As Victoria opened the box to find a stunning diamond bracelet, her phone buzzed again. Emily's number flashed on the screen. "Someone's persistent," James remarked, frowning. "Everything okay?" "Just work," Victoria lied, forcing a smile. "The fashion magazine needs approval for the wedding announcement layout." But it wasn't work. It was her past catching up with her. Emily wasn't just asking for a meeting anymore, she was threatening to come to the wedding and tell everyone the truth. Later that night, after James left, Victoria poured herself a glass of wine and finally opened Emily's latest email. The words made her blood run cold. "I'm not looking for money, I just want to know why you gave me up. I deserve that much. If you won't meet with me, I'll have no choice but to come to the wedding. I already have an invitation. It wasn't hard to get one when my birth mother is such a public figure." Victoria's hands trembled as she dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "Thomas, it's Victoria. I need your help again, like before, when we handled the adoption papers." Thomas Kane had been her lawyer back then, when she was just 20, and scared. He'd helped arrange everything, made sure the records were sealed. He'd also helped her reinvent herself, create the background story that let her enter New York's high society. "Victoria, that was a long time ago," Thomas said quietly. "Maybe it's time to face the truth." "I can't," Victoria whispered. "You don't understand. James's family, they're old money. They'd never accept someone like me if they knew where I really came from. And his children, they're already suspicious of me. If they found out I had a child out of wedlock, that I was just a small-town girl who got pregnant at 20. But she's your daughter." Victoria looked at the photo Emily had sent. The young woman had her eyes, her smile, but she also had another face in her features, the face of the man Victoria had tried so hard to forget. "She's not just my daughter," Victoria said. "She's Robert's too. And if anyone starts digging into that story..." She couldn't even finish the sentence. Robert's death had been ruled an accident, but Victoria knew better. She'd been there that night. The doorbell rang, startling her. It was almost midnight. Who could it be? Victoria walked to the door, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Through the peephole, she saw a young woman standing there, holding a piece of paper. Victoria's heart stopped. She knew that face. It was like looking at herself 25 years ago. Emily had come anyway. Victoria's perfect world was about to shatter. As she stood there frozen, memories flooded back. The small town she'd escaped from, the hopes she'd had of marrying Robert, the night. Everything went wrong, and the baby she'd held just once before giving her away. The doorbell rang again, and again. Victoria reached for the handle, her whole body shaking. Everything she'd built, every lie she'd told, every careful step she'd taken to become Victoria Reynolds, it had all led to this moment. She opened the door. "Hello, Mother," Emily said. "I think it's time we talked." Behind Emily, the elevator dinged. Victoria looked past her daughter's shoulder and her blood ran cold. James was walking toward them, his face confused, then shocked as he looked between the two women and saw what Victoria had hidden for so long, their undeniable resemblance. The carefully constructed facade of Victoria Reynolds began to crack, and through those cracks, the truth was finally seeping out. The silence in Victoria's penthouse was deafening. James stood in the living room, his face a mask of confusion and betrayal, while Emily sat on the expensive white couch, her hands clutched together. Victoria paced between them, her perfect world crumbling with each step. "So this whole time," James said slowly, "everything you told me about your past was a lie?" Victoria stopped pacing. "Not everything, just the beginning." "The beginning?" James laughed bitterly. "You mean the part where you grew up in Connecticut, went to private schools and came from old money? That beginning?" Emily watched the exchange, her eyes moving between her birth mother and the man who was supposed to become her stepfather in 3 days. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said softly. "I just wanted answers." But James wasn't listening. He was pulling out his phone, scrolling through something. "I'm looking at your real background right now. My private investigator just sent it. Mary Ellen Cooper from Pine Grove, Arkansas. Graduated from public high school, worked as a waitress." He looked up at Victoria, his eyes hard. "You weren't even Victoria until 25 years ago." Victoria sank into a chair, her designer dress crumpling. "I can explain everything." "Please do," Emily said. "Starting with my father." "Who was he?" Victoria's face went pale. "That's complicated." "Robert Blackwood," James read from his phone. "Local business owner. Found dead in his car at the bottom of Miller's Creek. Ruled an accident." He looked at Victoria sharply. 3 months before your daughter was born." Emily gasped. "He died before I was born? You never told me that in your letters." "Letters?" James turned to Emily. "You two have been in contact?" "She wrote to me after I found her," Emily explained, "but she never agreed to meet. She just sent a few letters explaining that she was young and couldn't keep me. She never mentioned my father at all." Victoria stood up suddenly. "I need a drink." She walked to the bar, her hands shaking as she poured herself a generous glass of scotch. "Robert was, he was going to marry me. We had plans, but his family, the Blackwoods, owned half the town. They didn't want him marrying a waitress. So, what happened?" Emily pressed. Victoria took a long drink. "They offered me money to leave town. I refused. I told them I was pregnant." She laughed bitterly. "That just made them more determined to get rid of me. But Robert, he chose me. He was going to give up everything for us. And then he died," James said. "Conveniently." Victoria's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the marble floor. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," James said coldly. "I'm just wondering what else you're hiding. Because the Victoria Reynolds I knew wouldn't have abandoned her. Child. She wouldn't have lied about her past. She wouldn't have created a whole new identity." "You don't understand," Victoria whispered. "That night when Robert died..." But before she could continue, the elevator dinged again. The doors opened to reveal Margaret Morrison, James's mother, the family matriarch. She was holding a tablet, her face thunderous. "James, what is this?" She thrust the tablet forward. On the screen was a newspaper article from 25 years ago. "Local businessman's death raises questions. Girlfriend missing." Victoria stumbled backward. "How did you..." "I had you investigated the moment James proposed," Margaret said coldly. "I just received the full report. I was waiting for the right moment to reveal it, but it seems the truth couldn't wait." She turned to her son. "This woman is not who she claims to be, and there's more, much more." Emily stood up. "What do you mean, more?" Margaret's eyes gleamed. "The police reopened the investigation into Robert Blackwood's death last year. They found new evidence. Would you like to know what they found, Ms. Reynolds, or should I say Ms. Cooper?" Victoria's face had gone completely white. "Please," she whispered. "Not like this." But Margaret was merciless. They found traces of brake fluid on the road above Miller's Creek. Someone had tampered with Robert's car, and the last person seen with him that night was his girlfriend, you. Emily backed away from Victoria. "No, you couldn't have." "I didn't," Victoria cried. "You don't understand. None of you do. Robert wasn't supposed to be driving that night. It wasn't meant for him." The room went deadly quiet. "What did you just say?" James asked. Victoria covered her mouth, but it was too late. The truth she'd buried for 25 years was finally coming out, and it was worse than anyone had imagined. Margaret smiled triumphantly. "Shall I tell them the rest, or would you like to confess?" Victoria looked at her daughter, then at James, then back at the woman who had orchestrated her downfall. She took a deep breath. "You're right. I do need to confess. But not just about that night. About everything, including what really happened to the first Mrs. Morrison." Margaret's smile vanished. Now it was her turn to go pale. "Mother?" James asked, confused. "What is she talking about?" Victoria walked to her desk and pulled out an old envelope. "I kept this all these years as insurance. I never thought I'd need to use it." She removed a yellowed letter. "Your first wife didn't die of natural causes, James, and your mother knows exactly what happened to her." The night that had started with Emily's arrival was about to reveal secrets that would destroy not one family but two. And somewhere in Pine Grove, Arkansas, a police detective was getting ready to board a plane to New York, carrying new evidence about a 25-year-old crime that would change everything. Margaret Morrison's perfectly manicured nails dug into the leather armchair as she stared at the letter in Victoria's hands. The penthouse's bright light suddenly seemed too harsh, exposing every line of fear on her face. "You're bluffing," Margaret said, but her voice trembled. Victoria smiled sadly. "Am I? Should I read it out loud? It's from Caroline, James's first wife. She wrote it the day before she died." James stepped forward, his face ashen. "My Caroline, what are you talking about?" "She died from heart failure." "That's what the death certificate says," Victoria agreed. "But that's not what really happened." "There's it, Margaret." Emily sat quietly watching the drama unfold. She'd come looking for answers about her own past, but she'd stumbled into something much bigger. "I found this letter when I was working as a receptionist at Morrison Industries," Victoria explained. "Back when I was still Mary Ellen, before I became Victoria. Caroline had hidden it in a company file, knowing her personal papers would be searched if anything happened to her." Margaret stood up suddenly. "James, don't listen to her. She's desperate. She'll say anything to distract us from her own crimes." But Victoria was already unfolding the letter. "Dear Mr. Kane," she read, "if you're reading this, I'm dead. And if I'm dead, it wasn't from natural causes, no matter what the doctors say. Margaret has been poisoning me slowly." "Stop!" Margaret screamed. James grabbed the letter from Victoria's hands, his eyes scanning the words frantically. "This is Caroline's handwriting. I'd know it anywhere." He looked up at his mother, horror dawning on his face. "Mother, what did you do?" Margaret's composure cracked. She was going to ruin everything. She'd discovered the truth about the company's offshore accounts, about the money laundering. She was going to go to the authorities. "So you killed her?" James's voice broke. "I protected our family," Margaret shot back. "Just like I've always done. Just like I did when I tried to protect the Blackwoods all those years ago." Victoria went still. "What did you just say?" Margaret laughed, a harsh sound. "Oh, you didn't think it was a coincidence, did you? That I knew about your past?" "I was there, Mary Ellen, in Pine Grove. The Blackwoods were our business partners. When Robert threatened to expose the illegal dealings between our companies, something had to be done." "You—" Victoria's legs gave out, and she sank onto the couch. "You were the one who tampered with the brakes that night?" "No," Margaret said coldly. "I hired someone. They were supposed to target your car, not Robert's. It was just bad luck that he drove your car that night instead of his own." Emily jumped up. "You tried to kill my mother? And now you know too much." Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a small revolver. "All of you do." But before she could raise the gun, the penthouse door burst open. Detective Sarah Martinez from the Pine Grove Police Department stood there, flanked by two new York officers. "Margaret Morrison," Detective Martinez said, We've been listening to every word. Put the gun down. Margaret's hand shook. You don't understand. I did everything for my family, for the company. James walked to his mother, his eyes filled with tears. No, Mother. You did it for power, for control. And you killed the woman I loved. 2 women, Victoria corrected quietly. Caroline and Robert. And you nearly killed me. Margaret's grip on the gun tightened. You don't understand. None of you. Do the companies, the money. It was all built on secrets. If the truth came out. The truth is already out, Detective Martinez said, stepping closer. We found new evidence in Robert's case. A witness came forward. He saw you meeting with the mechanic who tampered with the brakes. And now we have your confession about Caroline Morrison. Margaret looked around wildly, like a trapped animal. Then suddenly she turned the gun on herself. Mother, no, James lunged forward. But Victoria was faster. She tackled Margaret, sending them both crashing to the floor. The gun skittered across the marble, stopping at Emily's feet. As the police moved in to arrest Margaret, Emily helped Victoria up. They looked at each other, mother and daughter, both shaking from what had just happened. I never killed anyone, Victoria said softly. I just ran. I ran and reinvented myself because I thought the Blackwoods were behind Robert's death. I thought they'd kill me too if they found me. Emily hugged her mother for the first time. I believe you. James stood alone, watching his mother being handcuffed and led away. 25 years of secrets were finally coming to light. His first wife's death, his mother's crimes, the true nature of the family business. Everything he'd believed in was built on lies. Victoria touched his arm gently. James, I'm sorry. I know I lied about who I was, but I never lied about loving you. He turned to her, his face tired and sad. I know, but love isn't enough anymore. There are going to be investigations, trials. Both our families are going to be torn apart by this. Not torn apart, Emily said firmly. Put back together, the right way this time, with the truth. Detective Martinez cleared her throat. Ms. Reynolds, or Ms. Cooper, we'll need your statement. And Mr. Morrison, there's something else you should know. We found Caroline's diary. There's a lot more to this story. Victoria, James, and Emily looked at each other. This night had revealed decades of secrets, but somehow they all knew there were still more revelations to come. And somewhere in Caroline's diary lay a secret that would shake their world even further. The next morning, headlines across New York screamed about Margaret Morrison's arrest. Victoria sat in the police station's interview room staring at Caroline's diary. Detective Martinez had just handed it to her, and the weight of it felt heavy in her hands. You should read it, the detective said. There's something in there. About you. About who you really are. Victoria opened the diary with trembling hands. James and Emily sat on either side of her, their own shock about Margaret temporarily forgotten as they watched her begin to read. Dear Diary, Victoria read aloud. Today I discovered something that changes everything. The young receptionist. Mary Ellen Cooper, the one Margaret hates so much, and she's not who she thinks she is. I found adoption papers in Margaret's office. Mary Ellen wasn't born in Arkansas at all. She was born here in New York, and her real parents. God help us all when the truth comes out. Victoria looked up, confused. What is she talking about? I know who I am. I grew up in Pine Grove. Detective Martinez shook her head. Keep reading. The adoption was arranged by the Blackwoods, Victoria continued reading. They didn't just own half of Pine Grove. They were working with the Morrisons in a massive adoption scheme. They were taking babies from wealthy New York families and placing them with families in small towns across America. And Mary Ellen, she was one of those babies. Emily grabbed her mother's hand. What? Victoria's voice shook as she read on. I found her real birth certificate. Mary Ellen Cooper was born Elizabeth Morgan. Her parents were Richard and Diana Morgan, the banking dynasty. They died in a plane crash when she was just 6 months old. And the person who arranged her adoption, who placed her with the Coopers, in Arkansas, was Margaret Morrison. James stood up abruptly. My mother. She knew who Victoria was this whole time? There's more, Detective Martinez said quietly. Victoria turned the page. Richard and Diana Morgan, left their entire fortune to their daughter. Over $2 billion held in trust until she turned 45. Margaret and the Blackwoods worked together to hide the baby, to steal her inheritance. They never thought she'd end up back in New York, working at Morrison Industries. When they realized who she was, they tried to kill her. But they got Robert instead. The diary fell from Victoria's hands. "I'm Elizabeth Morgan," she whispered. "All this time," Detective Martinez nodded, "we've verified everything. The Morgans were real, and so was their fortune. You're their only heir, and you turn 45 next week." James paced the room. "So, my mother didn't just kill Caroline and Robert. She stole a baby, hid her identity, and tried to murder her to keep control of her inheritance." "The Blackwoods helped," Detective Martinez added. "They've already confessed. When they realized Mary Ellen, Elizabeth, was pregnant with Robert's baby, they panicked. The baby would have been another heir to the Morgan fortune." Emily touched her stomach unconsciously. "So I'm not just a waitress's daughter, I'm Morgan," Victoria finished. "We both are." Suddenly the door opened. Thomas Kane, Victoria's old lawyer, walked in. But he wasn't alone. Behind him was an elderly man in an expensive suit. "Ms. Morgan," the man said, looking at Victoria with tears in his eyes. "I'm Harold Bennett, your parents' lawyer. I've been searching for you for 45 years. Victoria stood up shakily. "You knew my real parents?" Harold nodded. "They were wonderful people. They loved you so much. When they died, Margaret Morrison convinced everyone you had died in the crash too. She arranged a fake funeral, while secretly sending you to Arkansas. I never stopped looking, but the adoption records were too well hidden. Until now," Thomas added. "When Emily started searching for her birth mother, she unknowingly started unraveling the whole scheme." Victoria looked around the room, at her daughter, at James, at the diary that had revealed everything. "So what happens now?" "Now," Harold said, "you claim your inheritance. The Morgan fortune, the companies, everything, it's all yours." James touched Victoria's shoulder. "You're richer than the Morrisons ever were. You don't need our world anymore." But Victoria shook her head. "This isn't about money, this is about justice. For my parents, for Robert, for Caroline, and for that baby girl who was stolen from her family." Emily hugged her mother. "We'll face it together." Harold cleared his throat. "There's one more thing. Your parents had another child, a son, born just before the crash." "He was adopted out too," Victoria gasped. "I have a brother?" "Yes," Harold said. "And you know him." "We found him last night, after Margaret's arrest led us to more adoption records." Everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath. "Who is he?" Victoria whispered. Harold looked at her sadly. "It's James. Margaret Morrison adopted him herself. You've been about to marry your own brother." The room spun around Victoria. James staggered back against the wall. Emily covered her mouth in shock. "All this time," James said hoarsely, "my whole life has been a lie too." Victoria looked at the man she'd been about to marry, seeing him with new eyes. They had the same nose, the same chin. How had she never noticed? Detective Martinez spoke up. "There's still more to uncover. Margaret's arrest is just the beginning. The adoption scheme involved dozens of families, millions of dollars, and more murders than we initially thought." As Victoria held her newfound brother's hand, with her daughter by her side, she realized their story was far from over. The truth about the Morgans, the Morrisons, and the Blackwoods was still unfolding. And somewhere out there, other families were about to have their worlds turned upside down by the secrets Margaret had kept for so long. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Morgan mansion, Victoria's true inheritance. She walked through the grand halls, touching the paintings her real parents had chosen, looking at old family photos where baby Elizabeth Morgan smiled in Diana Morgan's arms. "It's strange," she said to Emily, who walked beside her. "I feel like I should remember this place, but I don't." Emily squeezed her mother's hand. "We'll make new memories here." It had been a week since the revelation about Victoria's true identity. The press was having a field day with the story. The lost Morgan heiress, the illegal adoption ring, the murders. Margaret Morrison sat in jail, refusing to speak to anyone, including James, Victoria's brother. The thought still made her head spin. The doorbell rang, echoing through the massive house. Harold Bennett, now Victoria's lawyer as well as her parents' former attorney, walked in with a stack of papers. The DNA tests came back, he announced without preamble. They confirm everything. You and James are siblings, and Emily is indeed a Morgan heir. Victoria sank into an antique chair. Even though she'd known it was true, having scientific proof made it real in a new way. There's more, Harold continued. We've identified 3 other families involved in Margaret's adoption scheme, all wealthy New York families who lost children to mysterious accidents or disappearances. The children were placed in small towns across America, just like you were. Have you found them? Emily asked. One, Harold replied, Sarah Williams, or rather Rebecca Vanderbilt. She's a school teacher in Ohio. Victoria stood up quickly. We have to tell her. That's why I'm here, Harold said. She's downstairs. Victoria and Emily followed Harold to the mansion's sitting room. A woman about Victoria's age stood there looking out the window. She turned when they entered, and Victoria gasped. Sarah looked exactly like the Vanderbilt photos Harold had shown her, the same aristocratic features that had graced New York society pages 45 years ago. Elizabeth Morgan, Sarah whispered. Victoria, she corrected automatically, then smiled. But yes, I'm Elizabeth. The 2 women stared at each other, both victims of the same cruel scheme. Did you know? Sarah asked. All these years, did you ever suspect? Victoria shook her head. Never, not until Caroline Morrison's diary was found. What about you? I had dreams sometimes, Sarah said softly. Of a big house, a woman singing to me. But I thought they were just dreams. She pulled out an old photo. This was in my adoptive mother's attic. She died last month. That's when I started looking into my past. The photo showed 3 babies together on a luxurious blanket. The names were written on the back: Elizabeth Morgan, James Morgan, Rebecca Vanderbilt. We were friends, Sarah said. As babies. Our parents were close. Before Victoria could respond, the door opened again. James walked in, stopping short when he saw Sarah. Becky, he whispered. Sarah's eyes widened. Jimmy, Victoria looked between them. You know each other. James ran a hand through his hair. We met 5 years ago at a business conference in Chicago. We dated for a while. Sarah's face went pale. Oh, God. Harold quickly stepped forward. Don't worry, you're not related. Rebecca, you were friends with the Morgan twins as babies, but you're not their sister. Everyone let out a breath of relief. But this proves Margaret knew who all of you were, Harold continued. She must have watched you all your lives, making sure you never discovered the truth. Until now, Emily said. Suddenly, Victoria's phone rang. It was Detective Martinez, Ms. Morgan. The detective said urgently. You need to come to the station right away. Margaret Morrison is ready to talk. But she'll only talk to you and James. And she says she knows what really happened to your parents. Plane. Victoria looked at James, then at Sarah and Emily. The plane crash wasn't an accident. Just get here, Martinez said. And be careful. We just found out Margaret has a partner we never knew about. Someone who's still free. Someone who's been watching you all for years. As Victoria and James prepared to leave for the police station, Sarah grabbed Victoria's arm. There's something else you should know, she said. When I was going through my adoptive mother's things, I found letters, recent ones, from Margaret Morrison. She wrote that there was another baby that day, a 4th one. Who? Victoria asked. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. My twin sister. Margaret separated us, and according to the letters, she's someone we all know. Someone who's been part of this story all along. Victoria's mind raced through all the people involved in their lives. Who else could be hiding a false identity? Who else's life had been stolen by Margaret Morrison's cruel scheme? The answer was about to shake their world once again. The police station's interrogation room felt smaller than ever. Margaret Morrison sat there in her orange jumpsuit, her once perfect hair now grey at the roots, her manicured nails chipped. But her eyes were as sharp as ever as she watched Victoria and James enter. My children, she said with a cold smile. Both of you, though not the way I pretended all these years. We're not here for games, James snapped. You said you know. What happened to our real parents? Detective Martinez sat in the corner, recording everything. Victoria noticed a slight tremor in the detective's hand as she held her pen. Something had scared her. Margaret leaned forward. "Oh, I know everything. I was there that day, you see, on the plane," Victoria gasped. "What?" "I was your mother's best friend," Margaret said, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. "Diana Morgan. She had everything I wanted. The perfect life, the perfect family, the perfect husband. I was just the wife of a failing businessman watching my friends live in luxury." "So you killed them?" James's voice shook. Margaret laughed. "Killed them? No, darling, I saved them." Victoria and James exchanged confused looks. "Richard Morgan wasn't the man everyone thought he was," Margaret continued. "He was working with some very dangerous people, laundering money for them through the Morgan banks. When he tried to back out, they threatened his family." She paused, watching the shock on Victoria and James's faces. "The plane crash wasn't supposed to kill them," she said softly. "It was supposed to be their escape. New identities, new lives. I helped arrange everything, but something went wrong. Someone tampered with the plane, really tampered with it. Richard and Diana died, but they weren't supposed to." Victoria gripped the table. "You expect us to believe you were helping them?" "Check Diana's jewelry box in the Morgan mansion," Margaret said. "The one with the pearl inlay. There's a false bottom. You'll find letters there explaining everything. Your parents were supposed to disappear for a few years, just until it was safe. The babies, you two and Rebecca, were supposed to go with them. But instead you stole us," James said. "Separated us, kept our inheritance for yourself." Margaret's eyes flashed. "I protected you. The people your father was involved with, they're still out there, still powerful. Why do you think I worked so hard to hide your identities?" Detective Martinez spoke up. "We found evidence that someone else was pulling the strings all these years, someone above you." "Yes," Margaret whispered. He's been watching everything, controlling everything, making sure the Morgan children never found each other, making sure the truth stayed buried." "Who?" Victoria demanded. "Harold Bennett." The name fell like a bomb in the small room. "Our parents' lawyer?" James asked incredulously. "The man who helped us uncover all this?" Margaret smiled grimly. "Who better to keep the secret than the man supposedly trying to solve it? He worked for them, the same people your father was running from. He's the one who arranged the real sabotage of the plane. He's the one who ordered me to separate you children, and he's the one who's been using the Morgan fortune all these years to fund their operations." Victoria felt sick. "But he's been helping us." "Has he?" Margaret asked. "Or has he been controlling exactly what you discover and when? Tell me, has he let you access the Morgan fortune yet? Or is there always one more document, one more verification needed?" James stood up so quickly his chair fell over. "We have. To get back to the mansion. Emily and Sarah are there with him right now." "Wait," Margaret called as they turned to leave. "There's one more thing you need to know about Caroline." Victoria turned back. "Your son's first wife, the one you killed?" "I didn't kill her," Margaret said quietly. "Harold did, because she found out the truth. Not just about the Morgans, but about everything. About Sarah's twin sister. About who really controls New York's biggest companies. About the fact that Diana Morgan might not be dead after all." Victoria felt the room spin. "What did you just say?" "Your mother, Diana Morgan," Margaret said. "Harold only showed you photos of the male body from the crash. Diana's body was never found. And last month I received this." She nodded to Detective Martinez, who pulled an envelope from her files. Inside was a recent photo of a woman in her 70s, sitting in a garden, somewhere. She was older, but her face was unmistakable. It was Diana Morgan, and she was holding a newspaper dated just 1 week ago. "Find your mother," Margaret said urgently. "Find her before Harold does. She's the only one who knows the whole truth. She's the only one who can prove what really happened that day." Victoria and James raced out of the police station, calling Emily as they ran, but her phone went straight to voicemail. At that same moment, in the Morgan mansion, Harold Bennett was calmly pouring tea for Emily and Sarah, a small smile playing on his lips as he reached for something in his jacket pocket. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. Emily felt strange as she sipped the tea Harold had served. Her vision was getting blurry, and Sarah didn't look much better across the table. Harold Bennett sat watching them both, his grandfatherly smile never wavering. "You—" "No," he said casually. "I've watched you all for so long. Victoria in Arkansas, James here in New York, Sarah in Ohio. It was like a chess game keeping you all apart." Sarah tried to stand but stumbled. What did you put in the tea?" "Just something to make you sleep for a while," Harold said. "Don't worry, I'm not going to kill you. You're both still valuable pieces in this game." Emily's head was spinning, but she managed to press the emergency alert on her phone, the one Detective Martinez had given her. Then everything went black. Victoria and James broke every speed limit racing back to the mansion. Detective Martinez and her team were right behind them, sirens blaring. "I can't believe we left them alone with him," Victoria said, gripping the steering wheel. All this time he was the one behind everything. James's phone rang. It was Thomas Kane, their lawyer. "I just found something," Thomas said urgently. "I've been looking into Harold Bennett's past. 45 years ago, right after the plane crash, he changed his name. His real name is Christopher Blackwood. He's Robert Blackwood's uncle, the one who controlled the family business." Victoria nearly drove off the road. "What?" "It gets worse," Thomas continued. "He was obsessed with Diana Morgan. Had been for years. When she married Richard instead of him, he swore to destroy their family. The plane crash, the separated babies, the stolen fortune, it was all his revenge." They screeched to a stop in front of the mansion. Police cars surrounded the building, but the front door was wide open. Inside, they found the teacups, one broken on the floor. Emily's phone lay next to it, screen cracked. Sarah's purse was overturned on the sofa. "They're gone," Detective Martinez said, holstering her gun after clearing the house. "But we found this." She handed Victoria a note written in Harold's elegant handwriting. "Did you really think I'd let you win? For 45 years I've controlled everything. The Morgan fortune, the Blackwood Empire, even the Morrison companies, all mine. Your mother thought she could hide from me, but I found her. Just like I'll always find you. Want to see your daughter again? Want to save Sarah? Come alone to the place where it all began. Diana will be there too. Time for a family reunion." "The place where it all began?" James asked. Victoria's eyes widened. "The airfield, the private airfield where our parents' plane took off that day. It's still there," Detective Martinez said. "Abandoned now, outside the city." "He wants me to go alone," Victoria said. "Absolutely not," James protested. "We'll set up a perimeter," Martinez added. "Surveillance." But Victoria was already shaking her head. "You don't know Harold. Christopher, whatever his name is, he'll be expecting that. He's had 45 years to plan this. Emily and Sarah's lives are at stake. And our mother, if she's really alive," James said softly. Victoria touched the photo Margaret had given them. "She is. I can feel it. And she's the key to everything. Harold's obsession with her, the real reason behind the plane crash, the truth about the companies." Suddenly, Victoria's phone chimed. A text from an unknown number showed a live video feed. Emily and Sarah were unconscious, lying on what looked like an old hangar floor. And next to them, holding today's newspaper, sat an elegant older woman with familiar eyes, Diana Morgan, their mother. She looked terrified. Another text followed. "1 hour. Come alone or they all die. Time to finally claim your inheritance. Elizabeth, the real inheritance, not just money, but truth." Victoria grabbed her car keys. "You can't," James said, catching her arm. "I have to." She hugged her newfound brother. "But I'm not going in blind." She pulled out Caroline's diary. "There's something in here I haven't told anyone. Something Caroline discovered about Harold's weakness, about what really happened between him and our mother." Victoria opened the diary to a page she'd marked. "If Harold wants the truth to come out, he's going to get more than he bargained for. Because the biggest secret isn't about money or companies or stolen babies." She showed them the page. James read it and his face went white. "Oh my God," he whispered. Victoria nodded grimly. "Now you know why he's really been watching us all these years. Why he never killed us despite all his power. We're not just Diana Morgan's children. The truth hung in the air between them. A truth so explosive it would change everything. Not just for their family, but for every powerful dynasty in New York. Victoria checked her watch. 55 minutes left. Time to end this game. As she drove toward the airfield, the diary's revelation burned in her mind. Harold Bennett wasn't just obsessed with Diana Morgan, he was her twin brother, and he was also their real father. The old airfield looked like a ghost town in the setting sun. Victoria parked her car next to the abandoned control tower, her heart pounding. The place where her parents' plane had taken off 45 years ago was now overgrown with weeds, the runway cracked and broken. As she got out of the car, she saw movement in the largest hangar. Following her instincts, she walked toward it, her footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. Inside, the scene was exactly as in the video. Emily and Sarah lay unconscious on old blankets, while Diana Morgan sat in a chair nearby, her hands folded in her lap. And there, standing in the shadows, was Harold Bennett, her uncle, her mother's twin, and if Caroline's diary was right, her real father. "Welcome home, Elizabeth," Harold said softly. "Or should I call you Victoria? You've had so many names over the years." "Let them go," Victoria said, gesturing to Emily and Sarah. "This is between us." "Us?" Harold stepped into the light. "You mean father and daughter?" Diana made a small sound like a suppressed sob. Victoria looked at her mother, really looked at her, for the first time in 45 years. "You knew?" Victoria asked her. Diana nodded slowly. "I've always known. Harold, Christopher, he was my twin brother. We were closer than close, too close. When I married Richard, it nearly destroyed him." "Tell her the rest," Harold commanded. Diana's hands trembled. "The pregnancy. I told everyone the babies were Richard's. He believed it too. But Harold knew the truth when he threatened to reveal everything I ran. Richard helped me fake the plane crash, tried to help us disappear. But I found you," Harold said with a cruel smile. "I always find you, sister dear. And I made sure our children were separated, placed where I could. Watch them, where I could control their lives." Victoria's mind was spinning. "James, too, he's your full brother," Harold confirmed. "Twins, just like Diana and me. The Morgan Blackwood blood runs strong with twins. And Sarah here." He walked over to the unconscious woman. "Her mother was Richard's sister. When I discovered that affair, well, it made separating all of you even sweeter." "You're insane," Victoria whispered. "No," Harold said calmly. "I'm a businessman. Everything I've done was to build an empire. The Morgan Banks, the Blackwood Industries, the Morrison Companies. I've spent 45 years combining them, using your inheritance to create something bigger than any of you could imagine. By destroying lives, separating families, killing people?" Harold shrugged. "Necessary sacrifices. Caroline got too close to the truth, so she had to go. Robert Blackwood too, he was getting suspicious about the family connections. But you, my children, I've protected you, given you good lives, even if they were far apart." "Protected us?" Victoria laughed bitterly. "You stole our lives. I gave you new ones," Harold corrected. "And now it's time for the next phase." He pulled out a stack of papers. "Sign these. They transfer everything, the Morgan inheritance, the companies, everything, to a new holding company. Your daughter and Sarah will be released, your mother can go back to her peaceful retirement, and you and James can have your old lives back." "And if I refuse?" Harold pulled out a gun. "Then history repeats itself, another tragic accident at this airfield, but this time, no survivors." Suddenly, Emily stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, taking in the scene. Victoria saw her daughter's hand move slightly, reaching for something. Diana stood up. "No more violence, Harold, no more control. I won't let you hurt our children again." "Our children?" Harold's face twisted. "You never let me be their father. You hid them from me, tried to give them another man's name." "Because you're sick," Diana shouted. "What happened between us? It was wrong. Richard saved me from you, gave me a chance at a normal life." "Normal?" Harold laughed. "There's nothing normal about the Morgan Blackwood bloodline. We're special, Diana. Our children are special, and now they'll help me build something extraordinary." Victoria watched Emily's hand close around a piece of broken metal on the floor. Her daughter had been faking unconsciousness, waiting for the right moment. "You want the truth to come out?" Victoria asked, stepping forward. Fine, let's tell everyone. About you and Diana, about the inbred Morgan Blackwood dynasty, about all the murders and schemes. You wouldn't dare, Harold snarled. It would destroy all of you, too. Maybe, Victoria agreed. But I've lived a lie my whole life. Time for the truth. She nodded slightly to Emily, who suddenly swung the metal bar, hitting Harold's legs. He stumbled, the gun flying from his hand. Diana lunged for the weapon, while Victoria tackled Harold. They crashed to the ground as police sirens wailed in the distance. I told you not to come alone, Harold gasped as they struggled. I didn't, Victoria said. A mother always protects her children. You should have remembered that. James burst into the hangar with Detective Martinez and her team. Sarah was beginning to wake up, groggy but alive. As the police handcuffed Harold, Diana hugged Victoria. For the first time in 45 years. I'm so sorry, she whispered, for everything. Victoria held her mother, feeling Emily's arms wrap around them both. They had found each other at last, but as Harold was led away, he turned back with a chilling smile. You think this is over? He called. Ask your mother about the other babies. Ask her about the real Millionaire, the one even I never found. Victoria looked at Diana, who had gone pale. Mother, what is he talking about? Diana's answer would shake their world one final time. Back at the Morgan mansion, Diana Morgan sat in the grand living room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Victoria, James, Emily, and Sarah gathered around her, waiting for the explanation Harold's words had promised. Detective Martinez stood by the door, recording everything. Before I tell you this, Diana said softly, you need to understand something about the Morgan Blackwood family. The madness didn't start with Harold and me, it went back generations. What do you mean? James asked. The family had a tradition of keeping the bloodline pure. Diana's voice shook. Cousins marrying cousins, siblings becoming too close. They believed it made the family special, more powerful. When Harold and I were born, we were celebrated as perfect twins. The family encouraged our connection. Victoria felt sick, but she pressed on. And the other babies? The ones Harold mentioned. Diana looked at the old family portrait above the fireplace. That night, when we faked the plane crash, I wasn't running alone. I was pregnant again. Everyone in the room gasped. Triplets, Diana continued. I gave birth in hiding. Victoria and James were taken to safety, placed where Harold would eventually find them. I knew he would never hurt his own children. But the third baby... She started crying. I hid her where no one would ever look, where even Harold's money and power couldn't reach. Where? Sarah whispered. In plain sight, Diana said. I gave her to the one person Harold would never suspect, to Margaret Morrison. Victoria stood up so quickly she knocked over her chair. No. Yes, Diana nodded. Olivia, your former fiancé, James. She's your sister. James staggered back. Olivia, but she's the same age as you and Victoria, Diana finished. But she doesn't know. Margaret raised her as her niece, claimed her sister had died and left the baby to her. It was the perfect hiding place. Detective Martinez stepped forward. That's why Margaret finally agreed to talk. She was protecting Olivia. But Olivia is in Europe, Emily said. She left right after the truth about Margaret came out. Diana stood up shakily. No, she didn't. That's what Margaret wanted everyone to think. But Olivia is here in New York, and she's in terrible danger. Why? Victoria asked. Because she's the only one who can access the real Morgan fortune, Diana explained. When I was hiding, I set up 3 trusts, one each for Victoria, James, and Olivia. But they can only be accessed if all 3 siblings claim them together. It was my insurance policy. I knew that if Harold ever found the children, he'd need all 3. And I knew he'd never find Olivia. Sarah, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. The letters in my adoptive mother's attic, they weren't just about me having a twin. They were about all of you. My mother was Margaret's confidant. She knew everything. Diana nodded. Your mother helped us hide Olivia. That's why Margaret separated you and your twin sister, to protect you both from Harold. Because you knew too much, even as babies. Then who is my twin? Sarah asked. Diana looked at her sadly. Think about who else has been part of this story. From the beginning. Who else was close to Margaret, trusted with taking care of one of the Morgan children? Victoria's eyes widened. Detective Martinez. Everyone turned to look at the detective, who had tears in her eyes. Hello, sister, she said to Sarah. Sarah covered her mouth, staring at the woman she'd been working with all these weeks. Now that she knew, the resemblance was obvious, but before anyone could process this revelation, Victoria's phone rang. It was Thomas Kane. Harold escaped custody, he said frantically. And I just found Olivia's real location. She's at the old Morgan Lake house, but Harold's men are heading there right now. Diana grabbed Victoria's arm. The lake house, that's where Harold and I grew up, where everything started. He's taking her there to finish what he began 45 years ago. We have to stop him, James said. Wait, Detective Martinez, Sarah's newfound twin, said. There's something else you need to know about Olivia. Something Margaret told me right before we came to the airfield. She paused, looking at Diana. Olivia isn't just your daughter, she's also pregnant. Diana went pale. No, the Morgan Blackwood bloodline will continue, Victoria finished. Unless we end this now. As they rushed to their cars, Diana grabbed Victoria's hand. There's one last secret. One thing even Harold doesn't know. About your father, your real father. I thought Harold was... Diana shook her head. That's what he believed. What everyone believed. But the truth is even more complicated. And when Harold finds out, he'll destroy everything to keep it hidden. The truth about Olivia's pregnancy, the final secret about their father, and the deadly confrontation at the lake house would bring their family's saga to an explosive end. Thunder rolled across the dark. Sky as Victoria, James, Diana, and Detective Martinez pulled up to the Morgan Lake house. The old mansion loomed over the water, its windows glowing with an eerie light. Emily and Sarah had been left behind at the estate for their safety, but they were monitoring security cameras Thomas had managed to hack into around the lake house. He's here, Diana whispered, pointing to a black car partially hidden among the trees. Victoria's phone buzzed, a text from Emily. Olivia's inside, second floor library. Harold just went in. As they crept toward the house, Diana grabbed Victoria's arm. Before we go in, you need to know the truth about your father. Mother, we don't have time. We do, Diana insisted, because it changes everything. She took a deep breath. Harold believes he's your father because I let him believe it. It was the only way to protect you all. James frowned. What do you mean? Your real father, Diana said, was William Bennett, Harold's father. Victoria and James stared at their mother in shock. Harold's father? Detective Martinez asked. But that would mean Harold isn't their father. He's their brother, Diana finished. William. He found out about Harold's obsession with me. He tried to help me escape. We fell in love. When I got pregnant, he helped me plan everything. The fake plane crash, hiding the babies. But Harold killed him before we could expose the truth. So the real Morgan Blackwood heir, Victoria started, is Olivia, Diana nodded. Because she's not Harold's daughter at all. She's Richard Morgan's child, the only true Morgan heir. Suddenly a scream came from inside the house. They rushed in, following the sound to the library. Through the door they could see Harold confronting Olivia, who stood protectively cradling her stomach. You're lying, Harold was shouting. I am their father. The Morgan Blackwood bloodline is mine. No, brother, Diana said clearly, stepping into the room. You're not their father. You're their brother, and you killed our father to hide it. Harold spun around, his face contorted with rage. More lies. Father killed himself when he found out about us. He killed himself? Diana laughed bitterly. Is that what you've told yourself all these years? I saw you push him off the balcony of this very house. Right after he told you the truth about Victoria and James, Harold pulled out a gun, pointing it wildly between them. No, I am the heir. I built this empire. The children are mine. We're not your children, Victoria said firmly. We're your siblings, and Olivia is the true Morgan heir, Richard's daughter, carrying his grandchild. The baby. Harold's eyes fixed on Olivia's stomach. No, no. It has to be pure. The bloodline has to stay pure. He lunged for Olivia, but James tackled him. The gun went off, the shot shattering a window. As they struggled, Harold staggered backward, crashing into the old railing of the balcony. It gave way with a terrible crack. "Harold!" Diana screamed, reaching for him. But it was too late. Just like their father years ago, Harold Bennett plunged from the balcony. This time, there was no one left to hide the truth. In the days that followed, the full story of the Morgan Blackwood dynasty emerged. Margaret Morrison confessed everything from her prison cell. The true ownership of the companies was restored. The Morgan assets to Olivia, the Blackwood empire split between Victoria and James. Sarah and Detective Martinez discovered their own inheritance from their protective adoptive families. 1 month later, they all gathered at the Morgan mansion. The grand halls that had once echoed with secrets now rang with laughter as Emily helped Olivia decorate the nursery. Sarah and her twin sister, Detective Martinez, were finally getting to know each other. James had found love again with his former fiancée's nurse, who had stood by him through everything. Victoria stood with her mother on the balcony, watching the sunset. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. Diana smiled sadly. "The secrets are over. The lies are over, but our story, it's just beginning." Victoria touched her mother's hand. "What do you mean?" "William had another family," Diana said softly. "Before he met me, there's a whole other branch of Bennetts out there, with their own secrets, their own claims to the fortune." Victoria laughed. "Mother, enough secrets." "No more secrets," Diana agreed. "Just truth, and maybe, someday, healing." Inside, Olivia called out. The baby was kicking. They all rushed to feel it, this new life that would carry their complicated legacy forward. As Victoria looked around at her newfound family, her mother, her siblings, her daughter, her niece or nephew on the way, she realized that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or power, it's the truth. And sometimes the most twisted path can lead you exactly where you're meant to be. In the library, Caroline's diary sat on a shelf, its pages now read and understood. Next to it, a new book was beginning. The true story of the Morgan Blackwood dynasty, written by Emily, who had discovered her talent for storytelling through all of this, and in a small chapel in the garden, a memorial stone had been placed. Not for Harold, whose body had been claimed by the lake, but for William Bennett, their real father, who had died trying to protect his children from a destiny of darkness. The morning sun streamed through the mansion's windows, touching the faces of 3 generations of survivors. The cycle of secrets was broken. The truth had finally set them free. But somewhere in Boston, a young woman named Claire Bennett was opening a letter from her late father's lawyer. Inside was a photo of the Morgan mansion and a message that would start the next chapter of their ever-unfolding family saga. "Your father wanted you to have this when you turned 25. It's time you knew about your other family." The end.